Blood and business are usually kept strictly separate, but when a 20-year-old waitress poured a glass of Macallan for the most feared man in Chicago and casually pointed at his hand, a 20-year-old grave was suddenly torn open. One sentence, and the ghost of a murdered woman walked again. The Oak Room on Rush Street was the kind of establishment where the lighting was kept deliberately low, not for romance, but for discretion. It smelled of aged mahogany, expensive cigars, and the metallic tang of unspoken threats. For James Castellano, it was a secondary office. At 52, James was the undisputed head of the Castellano Syndicate, a man whose quietest whisper carried more weight than a politician's shout across the state of Illinois. Tonight, he was seated in the curved leather booth at the back of the restaurant, flanked by his underboss, Brian Croft, and heavily shadowed by two men standing near the kitchen doors. Across from James sat Arthur Pendleton, a rival operator trying to renegotiate shipping routes through the Great Lakes. The conversation was tense, filled with veiled ultimatums and the precise slicing of Wagyu beef. Chloe Bennett just wanted her shift to end. At 20, she was balancing a full-time nursing program at Loyola University and 30 hours a week carrying trays of overpriced steaks to men who never looked her in the eye. Her feet ached. Her uniform blouse felt stiff, and she had a pharmacology exam at 8 in the morning. She didn't care about the dark suits or the hushed voices. She only cared about the tips that would keep her studio apartment in Rogers Park from facing eviction. Table 7 needs a refill, the maitre d' hissed as he brushed past her. And do not interrupt them. Just pour and step back. Chloe nodded, grabbing a fresh bottle of Macallan 18. She approached the corner booth with practiced invisibility. The men were leaning in. "I'm telling you, James," Arthur was saying, his voice a gravelly murmur. "The unions at the docks are getting restless. We need a wider margin, or the whole pipeline bottlenecks in Detroit." James didn't look up from his glass. He simply raised his left hand, resting his knuckles against his chin. "The margins were set in 2018, Arthur. The unions answer to me. If they are restless, it is because you are failing to manage your end of the docks." As James lowered his hand to the table, the dim amber light of the chandelier caught the heavy platinum ring on his left pinky finger. It was an unmistakable piece. A square-cut black onyx, flawless and deep, flanked by two hand-carved, intertwining ivy leaves in the platinum. In the very center of the onyx, a microscopic diamond was set, catching the light like a sharp, brilliant star. Chloe stepped to the side of the table, uncorking the scotch. She reached over smoothly, pouring the amber liquid into Arthur's glass, then moved to James's. As she poured, her eyes fell to the table. She saw the ring. Her breath hitched. She stopped pouring. She stared at the heavy platinum band, the black onyx, the ivy leaves. It wasn't just similar, it was identical. It was the exact same impossible, intricate design she had stared at every day of her childhood, sitting on her mother's dresser in a velvet box. "Is there a problem?" James's voice was soft, but it carried a razor-sharp edge. He hated being stared at, and he hated hesitation even more. Chloe snapped out of her daze, her cheeks flushing crimson. "I know, sir. I apologize." She finished pouring the scotch, a drop spilling onto the white linen tablecloth. She reached quickly for her napkin to dab it away, her eyes darting back to his hand. The words slipped out of her mouth before her exhausted brain could filter them. "It's just... my mom has a ring exactly like yours." For 3 seconds, the entire restaurant seemed to stop breathing. Arthur Pendleton paused with his glass halfway to his mouth. Brian Croft, the sharp, calculating underboss sitting to James's right, suddenly went rigid, his eyes snapping from his scotch to the waitress's face. James went completely silent. He didn't blink. He didn't move. He simply stared at the young woman in the white blouse and black apron. The ring on James's finger was not a catalog purchase. It was not a family heirloom. It was a custom piece, designed 21 years ago by a master jeweler in Milan. 2 rings were made. One for him, and one for the only woman he had ever loved, Sarah. The woman who had been blown to ashes in a Lincoln Park car bombing 20 years ago, taking a piece of James's soul with her to the grave. The matching ring was supposed to be in that scorched wreckage. It was never recovered. "What did you say?" James's voice was barely a whisper, yet it cut through the ambient noise of the restaurant like a gunshot. Chloe took a step back, suddenly hyper-aware of the suffocating tension she had just triggered. The two men standing by the kitchen doors had already taken a step forward. I shouldn't have said anything, Chloe stammered, clutching the tray to her chest. I'm sorry. I'll just get your check. James's hand shot out with terrifying speed, his fingers wrapping around her wrist. His grip wasn't bruising, but it was an iron clamp. Look at the ring, he commanded, his dark eyes boring into hers. Describe the one your mother has. Now. James, what is this? Arthur asked nervously, looking around. Shut up, Arthur, Brian snapped, his own face having drained of color. Brian was staring at Chloe as if she were an apparition. Describe it, James repeated, his voice shaking slightly, a sound Brian hadn't heard from his boss in 2 decades. Tears of panic pricked the corners of Chloe's eyes. It's platinum. It has a black square stone. Onyx, I think. And on the sides, there are leaves, ivy leaves, twisting around the band. James's breathing shallowed. What is on the inside of the band? He asked, the words catching in his throat. Chloe swallowed hard. A bird. A tiny swallow, flying. It's engraved on the inside. The glass in Arthur Pendleton's hand slipped and shattered on the table. Nobody looked at it. James let go of her wrist. He leaned back against the leather booth, all the blood draining from his face. The untouchable, ruthless head of the Chicago syndicate looked, for the first time in his life, utterly terrified. The engraving of the swallow was a secret. Only he, Sarah, and the dead jeweler knew about it. What is your name? James asked, his voice hollow. Chloe, she whispered. Chloe Bennett. And your mother's name? Chloe hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to run, but the invisible gravity of the man in front of her pinned her in place. Sarah Bennett. James closed his eyes. A single, ragged breath escaped his lips. When he opened his eyes again, they were completely different. The cold, calculating mob boss was gone, replaced by a desperate, starving man who had just seen water in the desert. He stood up abruptly, throwing $100 bill onto the shattered glass, and spilled scotch. Meeting's over, Arthur, James said, stepping out of the booth. He looked at Brian. Get the car. Now. The rain started to fall, as the black Maybach sped down Lakeshore Drive, the tires hissing against the wet asphalt. Inside the soundproof cabin, the silence was deafening. James sat in the back, staring out at the blurred city lights, turning the onyx ring around and around on his pinky finger. His mind was a violent storm of memories he had spent 20 years trying to bury. 1,999. Sarah was an art restorer working out of a small gallery in Wicker Park. She was vibrant, fiercely independent, and completely oblivious to the underworld, James ruled. When she found out who he really was, she tried to leave. He wouldn't let her. He promised her safety. Promised he could shield her from the blood. He failed. The Moretti family had sent a message. A car bomb wired to the ignition of Sarah's vintage Volvo. James had been 5 blocks away when the shockwave shattered the windows of his town car. They found nothing but twisted metal and dental records. James had burned the Moretti family to the ground in retaliation, painting the streets of Chicago red for 3 years. But it never brought her back. Except, she wasn't dead. James looked up at the rearview mirror, meeting the eyes of Brian Croft, who was sitting in the front passenger seat. Brian had been his underboss since the late 90s. Brian was the one who had handled the police reports back then. Brian was the one who had confirmed the dental records with the corrupt medical examiner. You're quiet, Brian, James said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Brian kept his eyes straight ahead on the road. I'm processing, boss. It's a hell of a coincidence. A girl sees a ring, makes up a story to get a tip. She knew about the swallow, Brian, James said, leaning forward, the leather seat creaking under his weight. Nobody knew about the swallow, not even you. Brian's jaw tightened. So, what are we doing? You want me to pull her background? I already had Vincent do it while we were walking to the car, James said. Beside him, Vincent, his massive, silent bodyguard, handed over an iPad glowing in the dim light. James looked at the screen. Chloe Bennett, born August 14th, 2005. Mother, Sarah Bennett. James's heart slammed against his ribs. The bombing had happened in November of 2004, 9 months before Chloe was born. "She's 20, James whispered, the realization crashing over him like a physical blow. She's 20 years old. He had a daughter who was pouring drinks for men who would kill her if they knew who her father was. He scrolled down the screen. Current address for Sarah Bennett, 442 Elm Street, Evanston. "Change of plans," James told the driver. "We aren't going to the estate. Take us to Evanston." "Boss, it's almost midnight," Brian interjected, turning around in his seat, his face shadowed, strained. "If this is really her, if she faked her death, she did it for a reason. You kick down her door in the middle of the night, you might spook her. Let me send a team to do recon first. Make sure it's safe." James's eyes narrowed. He studied Brian's face, the slight sheen of sweat on his forehead, the tight grip he had on the door handle. Brian, the man who never panicked, was terrified. "I don't need a recon team for my own flesh and blood," James said coldly. "We go now." 40 minutes later, the Maybach idled at the end of a quiet, tree-lined suburban street in Evanston. It was a modest, 2-story house with a white porch and a meticulously kept flower bed. The porch light was on. James stepped out into the rain, leaving his umbrella in the car. He walked slowly down the sidewalk, every step feeling heavier than the last. He stopped at the edge of the driveway, hiding in the shadows of a large oak tree. Through the living room window, the lights were warm. A woman was moving around inside, picking up books from a coffee table. She was older. Her dark hair had streaks of silver in it, and she wore a simple, oversized sweater. But the way she moved, the tilt of her head, it was her. It was Sarah. James pressed his hand against the rough bark of the tree, his breath catching in a sob he refused to release. She was alive. She was beautiful, and she had hidden from him for 20 years. He took a step toward the porch, ready to cross the lawn, ready to rip the door open and demand answers. But as he stepped out of the shadow, his eyes caught something near the roofline. A small, matte black security camera, and another one angled near the garage. James froze. He knew security systems. These weren't commercial-grade ring cameras you bought at a hardware store. These were military-grade, encrypted pan-tilt zoom optics, the kind the syndicate used for their safe houses. A civilian art restorer hiding in the suburbs wouldn't know how to source them, let alone install and monitor them. Someone was watching her. Someone was protecting her. James slowly retreated back into the shadows of the oak tree. His mind raced, clicking puzzle pieces together at a horrifying speed. The corrupted dental records in 2004, the sudden disappearance, the high-end security system, the way Brian had tried to stop him from coming here tonight. He looked back down the street at the idling Maybach. Through the rain-slicked windshield, he could see the faint glow of a phone screen illuminating Brian's face. Brian was texting someone. A cold, murderous calm washed over James. The joy of finding Sarah alive was instantly eclipsed by the darkest betrayal of his life. Sarah hadn't just run away. She had been helped, and the man who helped her fake her death, the man who had stolen James's family and watched him grieve for 20 years, was sitting in his car. James pulled his coat tighter against the rain, staring at the house one last time. "I will come back for you, Sarah," he thought. "But first, I have a ghost in my own house to kill." He turned and walked slowly back to the Maybach, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He opened the door and slid into the back seat, the heavy thud of the door sealing them in. "Well?" Brian asked, his voice overly casual, slipping his phone back into his suit pocket. "Was it her?" James looked at Brian, his eyes dead and hollow. He reached out and gently patted the underboss on the shoulder. "No," James lied smoothly, his voice dropping to a terrifying purr. "Just a woman who looks like her. Tell the driver to take us home, Brian. We have a lot of work to do tomorrow." The Castellano estate in Lake Forest was a sprawling limestone fortress disguised as a manor. By 3 a.m, the heavy mahogany doors of James's private study were deadbolted from the inside. The room was bathed in the harsh, blue glow of 3 encrypted laptops resting on his antique desk. James sat perfectly still, his untouched espresso turning cold beside him. Behind him, Vincent stood like a marble statue, his massive arms crossed, watching the screens. The security feeds from the Evanston house, Vincent rumbled, his deep voice barely disturbing the silence. The encryption was high-tier, Mossad-level architecture, but I pulled the IP routing through the shadow servers. They bounced through 3 shell companies. James clicked a mouse, bringing up the incorporation documents for the final shell company. The name on the digital file read, Swallowtail Holdings, LLC. A bitter, humorless smile touched the corner of James's mouth. Swallowtail, he murmured. He always did think he was clever. He saw the engraving on her ring after the accident. He must have pulled it from the wreckage before the police cordoned off the street. Vincent tapped the screen. Look at the financial ledgers, boss. The money funding that house, paying for the girls' nursing school. It's all bleeding out of our Southside logistics operation. Brian has been skimming 3% off the top for 2 decades, washing it clean and playing the anonymous benefactor. James leaned back in his leather chair, closing his eyes. The pain of the betrayal was a living, breathing thing inside his chest. Brian Croft wasn't just a subordinate. He had been James's right hand, the man who stood by his shoulder at his father's funeral, the man who had supposedly hunted down the Moretti hitman who planted the bomb. Why, Vincent? James asked softly to the dark room. If he wanted to take the syndicate, he would have poisoned my drink 15 years ago. If he loved her, he would have taken her and run. But he kept her here, in my city, a 20-minute drive away. Why? Control, Vincent offered quietly. He gets to play God. He saves the queen, hides her from the monster, and gets to look the monster in the eye every single day, knowing he holds the leash. James opened his eyes. They were completely devoid of warmth, replaced by the terrifying, hollow void that had earned him the crown of the Chicago underworld. I want his crew isolated, James ordered, his voice dropping to a terrifying calm. Send Jimmy and his boys down to the Miami ports. Tell them we have a crisis with the shipment out of Bogota. I want Brian completely stripped of his loyalists by sunset tomorrow. Do not let him realize he is bleeding out until the knife is already in his heart. And the woman? Vincent asked. And the girl? Put our absolute best shadows on that street in Evanston, James said, standing up and buttoning his waistcoat. No one goes in, no one comes out. If a leaf falls on that lawn, I want to know about it. But they are not to be touched. They are ghosts, Vincent. And tomorrow night, I am going to bring them back to the land of the living. The next 24 hours were a masterclass in Mafia strategy. James operated with chilling normalcy. He held his morning meetings, he ate lunch at his usual table at Gibson's, and he signed off on the union payoffs. Brian sat beside him the entire time, oblivious to the invisible noose tightening around his throat. By 8 o'clock that evening, Brian was entirely isolated. His top lieutenants were on planes to Florida, his personal drivers had been reassigned by Vincent, and his encrypted phone signal was being mirrored directly to James's tablet. We need to check the inventory at the Navy Pier warehouse, James told Brian as they stepped out of the restaurant into the biting Chicago wind. Arthur Pendleton's margins are off. I want to see the crates myself. Brian adjusted his cashmere coat, shivering slightly. Tonight, boss? It's freezing out here. The inventory isn't going anywhere. Tonight, Brian, James said, looking him dead in the eye. I like to keep my house in order. Brian hesitated for a fraction of a second, a flicker of unease crossing his features, but 20 years of playing the loyal underboss forced him to nod. Of course, let's go. The Navy Pier warehouse was vast, echoing, and smelled of salt and decaying wood. The only light came from the halogen bulbs swinging gently from the steel rafters. As the heavy metal doors slammed shut behind them, the sound echoed like a gunshot. There were no guards, no workers, just crates of imported electronics hiding the illicit cargo beneath. Brian walked a few steps ahead, his breath pluming in the cold air. Section 4 should be over here. I'll get the manifest. I don't care about the manifest, Brian, James said. His voice didn't echo. It seemed to swallow the air in the room. Brian stopped walking. He slowly turned around. James was standing 30 feet away, his hands resting casually in his coat pockets. From the shadows behind a stack of shipping containers, Vincent emerged, a suppressed matte black pistol resting loosely against his thigh. Brian's eyes darted between James and the weapon. The color rapidly drained from his face. Boss? What is this? I had a very strange dream last night, James began, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. I dreamt about a bird, a little swallow, trapped in a cage made of stolen money. Swallowtail Holdings, Brian. Has a nice ring to it. Brian froze. His breathing stopped. The meticulous, 20-year facade shattered in an instant. He opened his mouth to speak, to lie, to deny it, but his throat worked soundlessly. You faked the dental records, James continued, taking another step. His voice was a low, vibrating hum of absolute rage. You found the bomb before it went off. You didn't disarm it. You used it. You pulled her out of that car, threw some poor girl's body in the driver's seat, and you let it detonate. You let me burn the city down looking for ghosts, while you bought a house in Evanston? James, listen to me. Brian choked out, backing away, his hands raised defensively. I saved her. I saved them both. You would have gotten them killed. You stole my wife! James roared, the sound finally shattering the quiet of the warehouse. He crossed the distance between them in 3 terrifying strides, grabbing Brian by the lapels of his expensive coat and slamming him violently against the steel siding of a shipping container. Brian gasped for air, his eyes wide with terror. She wanted to leave, he spat, a hysterical, defensive edge creeping into his voice. She found out what you were, Dom. She was pregnant. She begged for a way out, and I gave it to her. I protected her from you. James's grip tightened until the fabric tore. You protected her? You set up a sniper's nest of cameras on her house. You watched her for 2 decades. You played the anonymous benefactor, feeding her crumbs of my own money. You didn't save her, Brian. You collected her. She thinks I'm a lawyer who helped her disappear. Brian wheezed, a sick, proud smile twisting his lips despite his terror. She trusts me. You walk in there now, covered in blood like you always are. She'll run again. You're a monster, James. You always were. James stared at the man he had called a brother. He felt the heavy weight of the onyx ring on his pinky finger. He thought of the 20-year-old girl in the restaurant, exhausted, working for tips, unaware she was the sole heir to an empire. You're right, James whispered softly. I am a monster. He released Brian's coat and took a step back. He didn't look back as he turned and walked toward the exit. Vincent, James called out into the echoing dark. Take out the trash. A single, suppressed thwip echoed through the warehouse, followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting the concrete. James didn't flinch. He walked out into the cold Chicago night, his eyes fixed on the north. It was early morning when the Maybach pulled up to the curb on Elm Street in Evanston. The rain from the night before had washed the neighborhood clean, leaving the lawns glittering with dew. James stepped out of the car. He wore a simple charcoal sweater and slacks. No suit, no armor. He looked at Vincent, who gave a brief, solemn nod from the driver's seat. James walked up the concrete path. His heart was hammering against his ribs with a violence he had never experienced in any gang war. His hand shook as he reached out and pressed the doorbell. He heard footsteps inside. Light, quick footsteps. The door unlocked and swung open. Chloe stood there, wearing an oversized university sweatshirt and holding a mug of coffee. She blinked, her brow furrowing in confusion. It took her a second to place his face outside the dim lighting of the oak room. You, she stammered, taking a step back. You're the man from the restaurant, the one with the ring. James couldn't speak. He just looked at her. He saw his own dark eyes, but the shape of her face, the defiant tilt of her chin, it was all Sarah. Chloe? Who is it? A voice called from the kitchen. James's breath caught in his throat. Footsteps approached from the hallway. Sarah appeared behind her daughter, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her hair was pulled back, her face lined with the graceful passage of 20 years. She looked up, her eyes locked onto James. The dish towel slipped from her hands, landing softly on the hardwood floor. All the color drained from her face. She looked like a woman who had just seen a ghost step out of a grave. James, she whispered, the name tearing from her throat like a prayer and a curse. Chloe looked back and forth between them, bewildered and suddenly frightened. Mom? Mom, do you know him? James slowly raised his left hand, the black onyx and platinum ivy catching the morning sunlight. He looked at Sarah, tears finally breaking free and tracking down his weathered face. I brought the matching one home, James said, his voice breaking. He looked at Chloe, his daughter, the impossible miracle standing in the doorway. I'm so sorry it took me 20 years to find you. Sarah let out a shattered sob, pressing her hand against her mouth. The fortress of lies Brian had built, the 2 decades of running, of hiding, dissolved in the span of a single heartbeat. James took 1 step over the threshold, leaving the cold, violent world of the Chicago syndicate outside. He was no longer a kingpin. He was just a man, finally stepping out of the dark. The truth of blood can never remain buried. James reclaimed the years stolen from him, dismantling Brian's betrayal with the same ruthless precision that had built his empire. He finally stood on that porch in Evanston, not as a kingpin, but as a father and a ghost returned to life. He walked away from the syndicate to embrace a quiet life, finally placing the matching onyx ring back where it belonged.